It's the Black Real Estate Dialogue. Tune in. Tune in. Tune in. Tune in.
Redlining. So redlining is the practice of denying a credit-worthy applicant a loan for housing in a certain neighborhood, even though the applicant may otherwise be eligible for the loan. The term refers to the presumed practice of mortgage lenders of drawing red lines around portions of a map to indicate areas or neighborhoods in which they do not want to make loans. And so this is something that was prevalent for decades and decades upon decades all around the country. And so there would literally be red lines around areas where lenders refuse to make loans. And when lenders refuse to make loans, people in that community, it's harder for them to work towards home ownership. And so, this is something that was a big problem over the years. And to some degree, it's really still impacting and is part of the reason why there's so much blight in our communities these days. And so there are properties today that have racially restrictive covenants in their deeds. They can't be enforced, but the language still exists. In fact, when I purchased my property, when I received the deed, I was a little bit nervous, and I was kind of reading through it to see if there was ever a period in time or see if there was a racially restrictive covenant within that lease. And to be honest with you, for me, I think it would have made it that much sweeter just knowing that there was a period in time when I couldn't legally buy the property that I currently have. And for those of you who are familiar with LA, there's an area called Culver City. I went to an event last year talking about the racial history of Culver City. And, it was a forum with people of all colors, all nationalities, and there were multiple people, white people, who had racially restrictive covenants in their deeds. And they were just shocked by the fact that this was ever legal at a certain point. And so it's just very interesting to know that was the norm once upon a time. And so in some cities like Minnesota, these covenants were started in 1910. Real estate developers would purchase old farmland and divide it into 6 city lots, then sell the lots. And when the lots were sold, at that point is when the racially restrictive covenants became part of the property record. And so you can imagine, back in those times when real estate was kind of growing and investing in things of that nature, all the power in buying that land that's passed from generation to generation that we missed out on, unfortunately, because of racially restrictive covenants. So there was a big turning point. Which gets into the next segment. In 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was established as part of what was called the New Deal. This was an attempt to stabilize the housing market, and the hope was to create pathways to home ownership through 30-year fixed mortgages. And so at the time, people were able to purchase a property, get a 30-year fixed mortgage, and in many cases pay less for the mortgage than they were paying for rent at that time. And so under this, banks had a lot less risk, and the risk was placed on the federal government. This was supposed to create a pathway for middle and working class workers to buy homes. However, unfortunately, we were kept out of it at that time. And so the FHA made color-coded maps of cities and neighborhoods, and they divided them into 4 areas. So red was hazardous, and red was where communities of color, black people, brown people, and so on, where we lived, and those were red. Those were red, meaning that lenders would not lend in those areas. We were not covered under the FHA and all these new developments and things that were taking place. Yellow meant definitely declining, blue meant still desirable, and green meant the best. So you can assume, green, blue, these were all areas where white people resided. And so you can imagine, just take a moment to imagine, you are a white family in 1935, 1936, whenever this was taking place, and you're now able to take advantage of this opportunity to get a mortgage, to work towards home ownership, and this can be passed down generation to generation to generation. And so you can imagine the head start that white people had in this regard, and we were kind of just left behind. We weren't able to take advantage of those opportunities. And what makes it more interesting to me is that there was no evidence that residents of Black communities would not pay their loans back And there was also not evidence for the assumption that property value would go down because of the presence of black residents. I've watched multiple documentaries, and it's just incredible how, when a black family moved into a certain neighborhood, there would be an uproar because people would assume their property value would go down, simply for the presence of a black person or some other ethnic minority. And there was an explanation that came along with the ranking each area received. And so they refused to give any area a green light, which is the best designation in the legend, unless there were restrictive covenants in place. So you can imagine having a particular neighborhood. Let's say, for example, this neighborhood or group of blocks, there are no racially restrictive covenants in place, which means that they wouldn't get that designation. And so if you have one or two, three, or any amount of homes that didn't restrict the sale or lease to black people and other minorities, the ranking would go down. So this further incentivized people to include racially restrictive covenants in their property deeds. And so obviously we can tell it was systematic. It was something that was planned out. And the practice of redlining really institutionalized and spread the practice of racial covenants all over the country. You got to think about it from the perspective of somebody who's white. You're going to make sure as many properties in your neighborhood as possible have this racially restrictive language in order for you to get the green light designation. And so developers were told by the federal government that this was a best practice, and this is how you would get the best loan rates and also a favorable rating when they categorize the properties into the different colors that I mentioned before. And so it's very interesting because immediately after covenants were no longer enforceable, there was still incentive to not sell to somebody who wasn't white. Because let's say a white person sold to someone who wasn't white, they could be sued. They could be sued by anybody on the block, by anybody in the community, because of the assumption that the property value would decrease if it was sold to somebody who was not white. So you could lose the house and it would go to the first person who put the covenant on the land. And if that person was dead, it would go to their heirs. So immediately after, this is like the 1950s or so, this was still something that was a point of tension. So I say all that to say, you can imagine what it was like. You can imagine all of your families who maybe live in different parts of the North and the South, who for years could not, while these things were in place, could not own homes, could not get a mortgage, had to basically live in substandard housing. And, I say all that to say, we have a lot of catching up to do. I don't think white people are the bar or where we should aspire to be. But I do believe it's very important for us to be working towards ownership. I believe it's important for us to be learning about ownership. And I believe there are a number of reasons why this should motivate us to invest.
Are you looking for a community of like-minded individuals and access to experts in real estate?
Yeah.
Are you interested in real estate but need more support and guidance?
You know who it is?
The Black Real Estate Dialogue presents the Real Estate Investing Community. No matter how much or how little real estate experience you have, we've created a community for you because your perspective is important. Alright, tell me, where's the number one place where you can do Q&A with experienced guest speakers 2 times per month? How about unlimited access to past guest speakers' recordings? What about a private Slack channel to engage in daily discussion with everybody in the community to share resources and support each other? Head on over to blackrealestatedialogue.com. That's blackrealestatedialogue.com. It's the real estate investing community presented by the Black Real Estate Dialogue. Come join us today.
So for those who don't know about The Banker, it's a movie about, it's based on a true story. The 2 black men in the 1950s who get together and decide to buy a bank. And they use a white guy as the front man because obviously back then they weren't trying to let black people buy anything. That's the basic premise. And it was coming out on, the story was acquired by Apple. Apple was supposed to release it back in December or early January, and it got shut down. They pushed it back, and it was supposed to come out in theaters now, but now because of coronavirus, that's a dove. So it's basically just on Apple TV to see it. So, Sam, what do you think about the movie, man?
I thought it was great, man. It was very inspiring just to see, like he was driving and walking for dollars back then in the 60s and 50s, 60s, whenever it was. I remember he came and said, I came here to get into real estate. And I'm like, wow, for a black man to say something like that back then, I just had so much respect for it. But I enjoyed it, man. I enjoyed seeing their stories and progressions and struggles. I wish it ended differently, but there was a lot of big takeaways from it. So I definitely enjoyed it.
Yeah, it didn't have the best ending, at least not for the brothers, but
Yeah,
very believable. Well, I said maybe for the very end. I'm not sure about the very end. But fortunately, it's based on a true story, so it was gonna
yeah,
end like that anyway. It was like, but by the time the movie was over, they were in the 60s by then, but still, you know, it didn't end. It didn't end so good for them. And the movie wasn't just about buying a bank. It was basically about them just buying real estate and building wealth just in general as black people in those times. And it was just interesting the moves they had to make just to get it done.
definitely,
You know.
definitely,
So,
definitely. Yeah, it was. I was just fascinated by seeing how they navigated the system back in those days, and you know, it's so crazy because usually we're in a position of service to, at least back in those days, to white people, but they had a white guy working for them, and they were training him to be the front man, and they were the brains behind it. So they were calculating the numbers, calculating all the percentages, and basically showing him the business. And I was just blown away by that, and it was interesting to see that role switch back then.
yeah. It was interesting from the very beginning. The man, he was a little kid. He was
Yeah.
listening, ear hustling, and trying to
Yep.
learn about business from a young age. Oh, like, what were some of the big takeaways for you on that movie?
Yeah. So I feel like we we can't make excuses because even those, like, everybody goes through stuff, but we have so much more access to information, to people, to resources. There are a lot fewer barriers than they faced back then. Because think about it, they had to have a whole person be the front man for $1 million business. You know what I mean? And they still managed to succeed in the face of all of that. So for me, the first takeaway is that, if they could do it back then, facing what they faced back then, literally facing death, there's nothing we can't do now, especially if we work together, if we're open. Because think about it, he wasn't open to the partnership with his wife's acquaintance or friend or whoever Samuel L. Jackson was. He wasn't open at first, but once he became open, and even though they were different, they have, their styles ended up being complementary, and they ended up having a good business. So I feel like there's nothing we can't do together. Um, the second is creativity. They had to get creative. They could have, cried and complained and said, "Oh, racism and they're against us and this, that, and the other," but they found a way. Like, he was going up to these white people proposing different options, and he ended up having a partnership with the Irishman. He tried to get the loan by, name dropping, which the guy didn't appreciate, but then he did appreciate, because he's like, wow, this, he's black, but he's serious and he knows his stuff. And, obviously the wife screwed him over after Irishman died. But
Right.
that was another takeaway too. So there's a lot more, but those are like the two that come to mind.
I forgot about that part, but like you said, creativity. Yeah, I
Hmm.
forgot about that part. When he first got into real estate in California, he had to get creative with the deal just to get his first deal done. because he didn't have enough money to purchase the property and rehab it. And he convinced the guy to carry like seller financing.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, some creative deal he got between him and the bank, and he got it done. And also the persistence. The persistence also won over the Irish guy.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, sometimes you never know where you're gonna find an ally either.
Yep.
So that was interesting. Another takeaway I would say is definitely be prepared. Preparation is key. That guy knew his numbers inside and out, and that went a long way too. That impressed a lot of people and got a lot of things done for him.
Hi everyone, Sam here from the Black Real Estate Dialogue. Make sure to hit that notification bell and that subscribe button, and to visit us at blackrealestatedialogue.com.